Uh, Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the Weekend Debrief here on FingerLakes1.com, where we try to make sense of the headlines, and that is exactly what we're doing here again, making sense of the headlines, not being completely puzzled and confused by them. I am joined in studio by Ted Baker. He's the host of Finger Lakes Morning News. We're on Finger Lakes News Radio. Ted, we are here, and as per usual, we completely flipped on everything we are going to be talking about this hour. In the last 5 minutes.
Yeah, I thought 2021 was going to be different.
It's not. This is 2020.5.
Yeah.
Okay, so first things first. High school basketball, high school sports, moderate to high risk sports, they're happening, kind of, we think, we hope. There's a schedule. They appear to be starting this coming week, although maybe a little later than we initially thought or hoped, because of the snow and snow days and the requirements on practices and things like that. From where you stand, as you look at what a lot of these schools and, frankly, Section 5 overall is trying to pull off here, what are you thinking?
Well, I think they've done a pretty heroic job of scrambling around and getting this all together, because they went from having nothing to having schedules in place in a matter of just a few days. On the Finger Lakes Radio Group stations, our first game will be on Tuesday. WFLR will have a Penn Yan game. I'll have a Geneva High basketball game on Thursday. We have Auburn and Weedsport on WAUB. So we'll see how this all goes. I mean, we've had COVID postponements almost nightly in the National Hockey League since they opened their season. Buffalo Sabres coach just tested positive. He's on protocol. So, hopes are high, but we'll see what happens. I mean, I think no doubt at some point there are going to be positive tests and either players missing from the lineup or teams forced to shut down for several days or a week. But at least for now, we're going to have about a 5-week or so winter sports season, and then possibly some football in the spring, and then lacrosse and other spring sports late April. So they're trying. As big a sports fan as I am, I'm not really sure that's the greatest idea. I think it might have been a better idea to just write off the rest of the 2021 season and say, okay, look, by next Labor Day, we've talked about this many times, that if the vaccine rollout continues and gets better, that realistically by next Labor Day we might see rates down in that below 1% where we were last summer.
Yeah, and I think as the weather changes, this whole thing changes. That said, it's interesting to me that we're kind of in this rush it all pattern, just trying to get all of it done. Like you, I have few reservations of how 3 consecutive seasons crammed into basically like 3 to 4 months is really going to work out. I know they're trying to hold the line on some of the practice requirements and things like that. And that's one of the reasons why there is a minor delay here coming up because of snow day and stuff. But I just thinking about it purely from a injury standpoint, I can't help but wonder if there aren't going to be, or there couldn't be more injuries this year if students are literally rushing from sport to sport, so to speak, as one is wrapping up an abbreviated season and moving into the next.
I think that's probably less likely than it might have been 10 or 15 years ago, because I really think even at the high school level now, athletes train year-round.
That's fair.
At least under normal circumstances they do. But I think, I think they've probably been keeping themselves in shape and are ready for it. And a big part of what's driving this is just the fact that if you're a kid, and we can argue about the importance of sports and whether they're given too much importance in our society. They almost certainly are. And even as a big sports fan, I'll admit that. But, you've got kids, you have this limited window in your life to play these sports at a high school level and compete. I mean, if you're a lacrosse player, you lost your entire season last year, you were looking at maybe losing it again this year, and you never get that back. I mean, a handful of kids are going to be able to go to college, but for a lot of them, I mean, that's a big motivator for what it's worth that gets them to school. I mean, there are kids who probably wouldn't go to school or wouldn't want to go to school if they couldn't play sports. So I think that is what's driving a lot of this, is the idea that, okay, that and just the whole psyche issue. I mean, this whole pandemic, as we come up on a year before much longer, it's taken its toll on all of us, just in disruption from all the things that we took for granted before March of 2020.
Right, and there's also the implication of student athletes and their ability to obtain scholarships through athletics and things like that, and sort of what the effect of that will be or how that will be supplemented. Obviously, college is expensive. That's not news. That's not new, but it's another element of this. And every day that these student athletes either can't play or can't practice or can't whatever because of the pandemic, you're continuing to expand the quote unquote gap between being able to access these different opportunities and not. So that's kind of where it stands. When you look at how what I guess kind of boils down to like what a 35-day season, when normally the high school basketball season, using that as an example, seems to run from like the middle of November until March, April range.
Yeah, roughly mid-March.
Yeah,
for the
so
state championships.
How does that translate? How do you think that sort of affects what we see happen, where students will literally be playing either 2 or 3 games 2 or 3 times a week, every week for the next 4 weeks?
Going to be a lot of games. I mean, teams that have bench strength are going to be ahead of the game. I mean, I looked the other day, the Geneva boys roster lists 9 players. Yeah. That's not very deep to play. I just was talking to my colleague, Steve Penstone in Auburn. I believe that Auburn hockey has put together a 20-game schedule in 27 days.
Oh, wow.
7 off days in a month.
Wow. Well, they've got that energy, right? Kids have got that energy.
They better.
So let's shift gears a little bit. We're going to stay in the We're going to knock out all our pandemic stories right off the top here. Events, weddings, we're given the green light. Obviously, I am in the process of trying to figure out what a wedding is going to look like this spring. So the state came out last week with new guidance, up to 150 or 50% of the venue's capacity, whatever is less, with the caveat that everyone must test negative for COVID beforehand. The presumption is that it will be a 72-hour window before the event where that negative test needs to be produced. Interesting for a lot of reasons, because there was the rash of stories that I saw on all the the TVs, all the local news TV stations, and it was brides rejoice, couples happy, this, that, the other thing. And all I can think to myself is, as we're going through this process of planning ourselves, what? It is not at all. I actually think personally, just looking at the rules and what the requirements are likely going to be, I think that not only this is going to make it more difficult to have a wedding than before, when you had the 50-person max and no testing requirement. I think it's going to be a greater strain on venues. I think it's going to be a greater strain on local health departments, which have to basically serve as intermediaries between the venue and the state in terms of allowing events to take place, because they actually have to approve and green light every single wedding that takes place. Think about that, people. We're in the Finger Lakes, the wedding capital practically of the East Coast, so to speak. I am just totally confused about not just why but what is really being accomplished here? Because on one hand, you're saying, well, this is the governor giving, people who want to have larger gatherings the opportunity to do so. But at the same time, instituting a policy where it makes you scratch your head and say, well, if these are the steps we need to take to be able to do this, should they even be allowed in the first place? Like, if we need to make sure that if we need to have everyone test negative within 72 hours of an event that's going to have more than 50 people at it, should you really be having an event with more than 50 people at it? There's just basic questions that I think until we see the full scope of what this is going to look like and the new policy takes place March 15th, we'll probably see that guidance probably somewhere around 11:50 p.m. March 14th. Because even talking with different folks who are at some of the different venues across the region, like they're asking the same questions, and they don't really have, they've got their own policies that they have to sort of interweave into this. Like, for example, most wedding venues require that you have your final attendance list and your confirmed number of guests like a week to 2 weeks before the event. But if you have a 72-hour testing requirement, and the likelihood, I would assume in most circumstances where at least a handful of people are going to test positive, I'm not really sure how this helps. I'm not really sure how this helps the state stay healthier. I'm not really sure how this helps the state economically. I'm not really sure how this helps anyone. It certainly doesn't help brides and grooms to be, in my opinion, because this just really makes you scratch your head and say, what are we doing here?
We've seen this throughout the whole pandemic. State comes out with guidance. It raises more questions than it answers. And there's no reality check, like you say. Is this even a workable policy? It seems like policy for the sake of saying, hey, we have a policy. And what I don't understand is why there isn't a single comprehensive policy that covers people gathering in numbers. It doesn't matter whether you're a wedding or a gym or a movie theater. The virus doesn't know. It passes from person to person when there's close contact between someone who's infected and someone who isn't. So I don't understand why we just couldn't have a comprehensive set of guidelines that covers how many people can be in a place. I mean, it's like the infamous Cuomo chips. What public health purpose did that ever serve to force a winery tasting room to have to put a bag of goldfish crackers on your tab for $1? I mean, and that's what, I've said this throughout, this is what fosters disrespect for government. When government issues edicts that are anywhere from unworkable to downright silly and ridiculous, it makes us less likely to follow anything that they come up with in the future. So, I mean, you're trying to put together a wedding and you got people traveling from halfway across the country. Are they going to get their test where they are? Are they going to try to come to New York and then get the test? And if so, that's a whole other can of worms. So many of these things are just not workable, and there needs to be a secretary of workability or something that looks at all these and says, well, okay, this isn't going to work.
Well, one of the immediate criticisms that I saw online was, it doesn't appear as though the state is going to be sunsetting the 10-person max per residential, quote unquote, residential gathering anytime soon. So if you're going to have that on the books simultaneously while you also are saying, but if you get a bunch of COVID tests, you can have 150 people in a wedding venue together. Like that just, to me, it doesn't make logical sense.
Why can't we have a big Super Bowl party if we get everybody tested before they come?
Right.
There's been no consistency to it almost all the way through.
Speaking of inconsistency, heard about nursing homes? Wow. So obviously there's been, I'm not even going to try to go through and recap all of the nursing home related news from the last 2 to 3 weeks since we last got together here. But given where we stand right now, you've got lawmakers calling for resignations. You've got Howard Zucker kind of dancing around where the numbers were questions about how much he was shielding from the governor, or how much how many of the marching orders he was just taking from Governor Andrew Cuomo. Lots of questions, not a ton of answers. And it seems, if nothing else, one thing we do know right now, especially after a court ruled on the side of the Empire Center, we will very soon, I think, find out what the actual full death toll was via pandemic inside these these long-term care facilities.
Well, and I think the official number was 6,000. I think some people are expecting maybe double that. I have a couple of thoughts. The analogy I came up with earlier this week is the position that Commissioner Zucker and the governor are taking is that if you get into a house fire and they take you out of your house and take you to the hospital and you die at the hospital, that's not a fire death. Right. I mean, this semantics of, well, it's not a nursing home death because they died here, they died there. That's number one. The other thing is there's been a complete lack of any contrition, any admission of any possible fault whatsoever on the part of the governor. It would have been very easy for the governor to say, I made what I thought were the best decisions. If I didn't, I'm terribly sorry. I feel for the people who died and their families, and I'll do my best not to make any of those kinds of mistakes again. He's just not capable of that. I mean, this is a man who wrote the book, How I Killed COVID, in the middle of the pandemic, and he's going to have to add a few new chapters on, because last I heard it came back.
Yeah, and to this point, I think there's a lot of nuance, right? Like, for example, there's a bunch of these different scenarios that were playing through my head. Like, a person who's been in a nursing home for 2 or 3 years and goes to the hospital for a quote unquote unrelated thing and they test positive, or someone who, sick, dies after they've passed, they test positive. Not that it is what definitively, killed that individual, but, there's all of these nuanced situations that have come up. And I think what people, what we're really going to end up seeing out of this is effectively the total number of people at nursing homes who died, period, like in this entire expanse of time. Now, I think it's going to be very difficult for anyone, no matter how deep they go on reporting, no matter how, I thought the New York Times piece last weekend was really interesting, where it basically ran through all of the top health officials in the state that have resigned over the last several months. It's going to be very difficult to prove that there was intentional neglect, or that there was, some sort of policy coming from the state down to either shield numbers or, that will take almost like a Watergate level kind of like investigation. It's not going to be done in the news.
Yeah, I don't think the governor, I don't think he did anything in bad faith. I think covering up the numbers was done in bad faith. I think he thought he was doing the right thing by sending some of these people back into nursing homes, and I think clearly in hindsight it wasn't a good idea. And I think that's what a lot of people would just like to see, would be to the governor to just say that wasn't a good idea. But we've been almost a year into this, and there's never been any of that. I don't think the governor has ever once said, I apologize for anything, or this decision wasn't my best. His story continues to be that every single thing that's gone right has been because of him, and everything that hasn't is because of somebody else. I mean, blame the federal government for lack of vaccine. I think that's just what people would like to see, is just a little bit of humanity from this man, to say, yes, these people died, it's terrible, it looks like I didn't make the right decision. I'm terribly sorry. I tried to do the best I could with the information I had. And just that acknowledgement, I think, would go a long way. But I think we all know that that's not going to come.
Well, in playing devil's advocate here, if I'm a supporter of the governor, that's not going to fix it at this point. Like, that's not going to change what people think of Governor Cuomo at this point, right? Like, that apology, that contrition, that finally saying some things in good faith, like, that isn't going to change the damage that's been done.
No.
I think when we really sit back and reflect on this, and I'm not saying now, I'm saying like at the conclusion of the pandemic, when it is truly behind us, and we look back at the state response, I think the big takeaway will be that people really missed, and I'm not exactly sure why. Maybe it had something to do with Donald Trump, but I think people really missed on what they were seeing Governor Cuomo for. I think they saw Governor Cuomo for a crisis manager that he wasn't. I think they saw him for the daily briefings, and they were comparing it to what they were seeing out of the federal government. And on its surface, it was better in terms of communication. But what we found out, at least in this specific area, is that some of the information being conveyed was either being conveyed in bad faith or just wasn't a complete picture of what was going on.
Right. I think in many other states, a lot of the daily briefings were being done by health officials.
Right.
It's okay that the governor's not an expert on everything, and someone should tell him that, because he seems to think that he is. And just step aside and the reason all these people in the health department resigned, a big part of it is that he put his budget director in charge of making a bunch of health decisions. I mean, you can't stand there every day on camera at 11:30 or whenever it is and tell us science is making the decisions, when it's very easy for us to see that in many cases science is not what's making the decisions.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize here, like, there is so much that we still don't know, and there's going to be so much to dive into, not just on this show, but journalists are going to be breaking this thing down for years to come.
And there are some gray areas. I mean,
yeah.
Because if someone's a nursing home resident and they go to the hospital and they get COVID at the hospital, is that a nursing home death? I mean, I understand there's some room for interpretation of these numbers.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the story out of the Victor Central School District. In particular, I want to focus on some of the community reaction that we saw this week. Obviously, they were hit with a ransomware attack. Not uncommon. It happens all the time. It locked up their network. It locked up their phone system, which is tied to the network. Unfortunately, when your phones go down, you have to call Spectrum, and it's usually a 2 or 3 hour phone call. Turns out when you're a school district and the network's even larger, it's even more complicated. So there was no school for a good chunk of the week as of today while we're recording this. Students pre-K through 4, I believe, went back today, and the plan is to bring the rest of them back in person next week, but they still don't have internet access. It seems as though phone systems have been brought back online, but that reaction that I talked about, I was and I knew it was going to happen eventually, right? Because people are already on sort of a cliff's edge. Some parents are already on a cliff's edge with this thing. If their kids are out of school for more than a couple days, all of a sudden they start to go down the warpath, so to speak. And I just cannot fathom, like, some of the feedback that parents in 2021 were giving the district in form of, frankly, cruel Facebook comments and things like that. Even statements to some of the TV stations in Rochester were geared towards, why the hell do we rely so much on the internet? Can't we teach kids without the internet? It's 2021. No, you can't.
Right. And
there's no point in teaching kids about life without internet or in an environment without internet, because as soon as they leave the school, they're completely consumed by internet. The reason why a lot of school districts, and I've talked about this on podcasts, I've interviewed superintendents about this, one of the biggest reasons why digital technology is being used so aggressively in school districts is because of the cost associated with the other stuff. Textbooks are freaking expensive. When I was in high school, back in what now feels like the Stone Ages, the when you go into every year, you get your textbooks for different classes, and you go to the beginning of the book or the back of the book, and you can see who had it and how old it is. In 2007, 2008, and 2009, some of our history books were 20 years old. It's incredible to me that people still and I think it gets back to what is school now? What do parents really treat school as? They're much less concerned about what their kids are learning, and they're much more worried about just getting their kid out of the house and having that source of free daycare.
Yep.
If there were ever a time when we needed to, I would have thought that by now, at this point in the pandemic, that people would have been a little more cozied up to the idea that maybe the way they've been viewing K through 12 education has been a little skewed or a little wrong. Obviously, that's not the case, because this has exposed the exact same ugly response that I've been listening to people spew out for the last 12 months.
We just haven't had time for it. I mean, you and I talk a lot about what the post-pandemic world is going to look like, and I've said, because of those very cost savings you were talking about, I think when this is all over, at least some school districts are going to entertain the idea of 1 or more days a week that are remote learning, even when they don't need to be, just to save the money. But it's we've been so caught up in this and so beaten down psychically that nobody's had a chance to sort of step back. When everything in your world is falling apart, when you can't plan a wedding and you can't have a Super Bowl party and you can't go out and eat and you can't shop here and you can't do this and you can't do that, it's just the straw that breaks the camel's back. Now, okay, we've got this routine with our kids at school, we're kind of coping, and then that gets all blown up. I don't know all the details of this particular attack, but I also know that almost all of us who use computers or on the internet don't back up like we ought to. I think if you had a good backup routine, and again, I'm no expert here, so if I'm wrong, call me on it, feel free. But if you had good backups, you could disconnect from the internet, back everything up, reconnect, and probably solve the problem. That's number one. Number two is, people always say, well, why aren't we secure from these kind of things? You can build the greatest gate in the world, but if somebody walks over and opens the door and lets you in, it does you no good. And that's how these things happen. I mean, our radio group email network, we've been hit over the last several months with all kinds of phishing attacks.
Yeah.
And they look legitimate. I just got an email the other day, looked like it was from the boss, had a Word document attachment that had what looked like a pretty legitimate title, and I deleted it because there was no explanation. And I said, okay, he's not going to send me something and not explain what it is. But a lot of people aren't as sophisticated. And even if you are fairly sophisticated, it's still easy to get fooled and click on that attachment. I mean, I'm assuming that's probably what happened in Victor, is someone opened an email attachment that then spread this malware throughout their network.
Yeah, and kind of piggybacking off of that, I would simply argue that, having good backup plans are great, but they're just plans, and, you're competing against hackers who just spend all of their time trying to figure out ways to foil those plans.
Well, you have to do it consistently. I remember many, many years ago, my daughter got on some kid's website when she was young, and our computer started going blue screen and black screen, and everything, all heck's breaking loose. And I had done a backup like the day before, and I said, watch this, honey, and click, 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 and we were back in a few seconds because we had a backup. But then if I were to look at my computer today at home, my last backup was probably summer of 2017 or something. So, I mean, people have to be more diligent about this stuff when it's mission critical. But I also think we need better education. People are very trusting. Yeah. They see, a Word document, and maybe they don't know. I mean, I use Thunderbird for email. You hover your mouse over the link that says it's from your bank, but the website that you see when you hover over that link doesn't have anything to do with your bank, and it's junk, and you delete it. But not everybody knows that. So I think there's going to have to be a concerted effort to educate people on what these attacks are, and that if you're not sure, just don't open it up. I've responded to emails from people that I'm pretty sure were legit, but just said, sorry, I don't really know you, and I don't open attachments from people I don't know, so call me and explain who you are and why I should open this.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where I'm not really sure that education is necessarily the solution to the problem, just because I think this is partly the world that we live in now. And there's this constant evolution happening, and, IT is very fluid, and it is something that's constantly changing. Network management is constantly changing. So just, understand that there are going to be hiccups like this, and it might mean that your student can't go to school for a couple days, but, they were able to because of the pandemic and because of the focus on remote learning. The students in the Victor Central School District were able to keep learning and not be interrupted the whole week. So, you have that where, had this happened 2 years ago before the pandemic, it would have just been no class, no school, just a week straight up lost.
Right.
So, there's silver lining if you choose to look for it.
Well, and also it's part of the same mentality. We've just grown to, we're so unaccepting of any kind of failure. I mean, if Spectrum Internet goes out for a half an hour, people just get apoplectic about it. These things are going to happen. Same thing with the power outages.
Oh, yeah.
We have a major storm, and they're having to bring crews in from 5 states away, and people are upset because my power's been off for 45 minutes. Get a blanket and a book and deal with it.
Yeah, just deal with it. That works. So let's see here. Geneva has a police review board.
Sort of.
In theory, kind of, yeah. So 6-3 was the final vote. A lot of unanswered questions still. Like cost, makeup, how it's going to sort of function in some regards. At the meeting this week where it was approved, finally, after failed meeting attempts, failed public hearing attempts, and a bunch of other failures along the way. Is there hope for the average person who's sitting in Geneva and seeing this particular issue just take all of the energy that city council has to spend, that maybe there's going to be renewed focus on some other items now that the city council has gotten over the hill, so to speak, on this particular issue, where now they can focus on working out the details. That can kind of happen in the background, and other important things, equally important things, I dare say, can also be addressed as well.
To a degree, but we haven't heard the last of this. I don't.
Of course not.
I don't think these the revisions or taking care of the details is going to happen behind the scenes. I think it's still going to be out in the open, because at the end of the day, what it seems like is that the power structure was heard, and the regular people who were the reason for this in the first place really weren't. Particularly minority communities. I don't think they feel like they got a fair shake. I think that this board is about as close to a Christmas gift for the police department as you can ask. I don't think it's going to function in the way that it was really intended to. I don't think it's much of a difference than the way we've done things in the past, which is there's a police shooting of some sort. The police investigate it, and the police say the police are blameless. Remember the original name was the Accountability Board, and now no longer are we holding the police accountable. We're simply reviewing them. I just don't think, I don't think it was a good job by anybody involved, and I don't think, the first time that there's some controversial act, and this board steps up and says nothing to see here, move on. All these wounds are going to be ripped open again, and we're going to be right back where we started. Yeah,
and I think I am cautiously optimistic about giving it the benefit of the doubt and giving it a chance to see if it's going to see if it can work. What I'm much more interested in now is, now that you've had these really heated, contentious interactions, not just between council members, but between council members and the community, can council continue governing for the entire community? Can city council continue to do, or I guess start to do, sort of the essentials of what people expect out of a city council. There has been, it's been very interesting because, and I realize that this is a huge issue, and I realize that it was very difficult for the city of Geneva to get to where it is now. But creating a review board or an accountability board, whatever you want to call it, did not need to be this difficult. It did not need to take this long. It did not need to be any of the things, basically, that it was throughout all of last year.
Well,
and this city council lost an entire year because of it. And it's still not fully across the finish line.
What we saw was the same thing we're seeing now at the federal level. The Geneva City Council has its conservative bloc. They have their liberal bloc. The two agree on almost nothing. And so every issue winds up being looked at through that lens. I mean, every single issue they take up, there's going to be this side and this side who don't agree about anything. I don't know, and I'm not sure how we get that back. I mean, we've look what we've seen on the federal level. We have a congresswoman who has called for the death of the Speaker of the House, who believes that a Jewish space laser started the fires in California, and who believes that Hillary Clinton drinks children's blood. And she's still a member of Congress. I mean, these are different times. I mean, I don't know how we get back to the time when we settle for half a loaf and we say, okay, the conservatives will get some of what they want, the liberals will get some of what they want, and we'll make it work together. There's just more polarization than there's ever been, and we've seen it trickle down from the federal government to the state and now to the local level. Yeah, and I think unfortunately, it puts a lot of emphasis on just the numbers, like the number makeup of whatever the governing body is. Like it really boils politics down to having a quote-unquote governing majority, which is what we hear about in a lot of other countries that aren't the United States. And it's a little disappointing. I'm somewhat optimistic that I think over the next 4 to 8 years, I do believe that the country can get back to, how it functioned before in terms of, maybe a little more working together. But at the same time, I think a lot of that is really overstated when people think back to the quote unquote glory days. I think a lot of that is overemphasized. It didn't really exist in the way that a lot of people think it did before Trump came along. Because there's this assumption that Trump was the catalyst that just changed everything. Trump was sort of the end of the line, if you want to call it, on a 30-year path that wasn't that great. And also, another factor I think that comes into play with the Geneva City Council is remember that this was a pretty inexperienced council when they took over. Yep. There was a lot of change and a lot of people who hadn't done this before. So maybe, to look on the bright side, with a little more experience, they'll begin to understand how to do their jobs better. And I'm not saying they didn't do their jobs well, but just that inevitably you get better with experience. So here you have a lot of people who are brand new to city government in any form having to deal with this very contentious issue. Yeah, and again, this is something that we'll, of course, be talking about over the next several months because it'll be interesting now to see how and where City Council goes from here. Next up, though, a pretty huge story out of Schuyler County. Last weekend, we published a story that was broke by the Wet Couch Radio podcast. I want to get that right. Danielle Matthews, wife of former Watkins Glen police sergeant in charge Brandon Matthews, shared her story of alleged longtime sexual harassment and verbal abuse at the hands of Mayor Leszyk. I should emphasize here that there's another portion of this story that we're going to talk about in a few minutes, but the alleged harassment took place before and after he was elected. So that's worth noting. If you want to read the story, I've linked to it in the show notes, and I've also kept it on the front page so people can get a feel for what's going on down there. One of the more breathtaking kind of stories that I've been involved with in the last few years. Just listening to that, the host of the podcast, Stacy, did a remarkable job, not just leading the conversation, but
guiding the way so that Danielle could share her story. Of course, this is something that's playing out in real time. Her family has filed a notice of claim, soon to be a lawsuit against the village. That will undoubtedly, go after the whole civil penalty side of things. There's practically no path forward on the criminal side, so that's out the window. But you know what? Like, to me, the interesting takeaway here is in a lot of communities, and unfortunately it's a lot of communities that don't have really strong, robust coverage of local government, you tend to see these, and I'm not saying it's always sexual harassment or always verbal abuse or whatever the case may be, but you tend to see these alleged incidents of abuse of power. And that is what this boils down to, abuse of power. I after I wrote the story, really the only takeaway thought I had was, this is why we need journalism. This is why we need good journalists, and thank God for Stacy, who hosts that podcast, and putting this story on the record, because if not, we wouldn't have heard about it.
Yeah, and you said it, the word is power. A lot of people will tell you that very often sexual abuse is more about power than about sex. It's a heady feeling to have power over someone, and especially when it's someone that you can, in your official capacity, make miserable or promote or help out. It's probably a lot more of this happens than we know about, but it's a good point. As journalism shrinks, who's gonna bring this up? Thank goodness. And again, the charges are allegations at this point, obviously.
Yep.
But if true, then it's a pretty valuable service by that podcast to bring this out in the open.
Yeah, and really important. Don't want to underemphasize here the fact that Danielle Matthews was strong enough to actually share her story, and that I think is just as important as the actual process of giving platform to voices like that. So it's just kind of one of those things. Now, here we go. This is where, for me, things just took a turn. So one of the first pieces of feedback we got about a half dozen times was, did you look into his career, referring to the Mayor Leszyk, as a law enforcement officer? He was a state trooper, had a lengthy career with them, rose through the ranks, what appeared to be a pretty successful one at that. So because of the 50A changes that happened last year, if you're unfamiliar with that, do a Google search. You'll understand it pretty quick. Basically allows anyone in New York State to access the personnel records if justified, or if compelled to do so. Anyway, I submitted a FOIL request on February 2nd to basically obtain any complaints that were formalized against Leszyk while he was a police officer. I received a response within hours, acknowledging receipt, which is part of the FOIL process. Within 5 days, you have to have acknowledgement of the initial request, and then within 20 days, you've got to have, quote unquote, an answer, or roughly that timeline. The immediate response that I got was that it would take up to or approximately 60 days to get a response to that request. And maybe one of the frustrating things for me was that the response seemed to come without any real investigation of what I was looking for. It was just simply like, here, this is how long it's going to take. Now, I checked with the Committee on Open Government. I checked with a couple other folks who are lawyers who work in this kind of stuff, and all of them said, legally speaking, the state is completely in its right to say it could take upwards of 60 days. The only recourse would have been after 30 days to take no response is a denial of the request and start the legal proceedings of obtaining the answers. So I did what any good millennial would do in that situation, and I tweeted about it. And I didn't tag anybody. I didn't @ anybody. I literally just shared over the course of like 9 or 10 tweets what exactly happened. and how insane it seemed to me that what should be a pretty simple request, especially without having gone through any intense interrogation of what the request was that I was making, was a completely unreasonable timeline. 60 days just, it didn't add up.
Right.
So about 3 hours after I sent that tweet, I get an email from the FOIL office for the state police. And I don't know if it was a coincidence or if it wasn't. But it was an answer to the FOIL request, full answer to the FOIL request. Now, there were no records of complaints against Mayor Leszyk during his time as a police officer with New York State Police. Take that with a grain of salt, but it was a real answer. And, you know, in this case, it helps answer a question that, you know, probably people would have assumed the opposite was true, judged by the allegations that have been brought forward in Watkins Glen. The flip side of it is, you know, if it wasn't the thread of tweets that I sent out that sent off some sort of alarm bell in that office, is that just their default answer to everything? Sorry, it's probably going to take 60 days. Bye. Like, that is so wildly unacceptable and completely not the point of what, because a FOIL request, when you really boil it down, is a reporter or a journalist asking for individual care on a topic. So they're asking the agency to spend their time critically answering a question. And it seems like you get the exact opposite under the circumstances right now. And I don't know if that's brought on by the pandemic or 50A or both or whatever the case may be. But, you know, to me, the whole thing fell flat, and I just couldn't really believe it. I'm like, this is not what this was intended to be at all.
Well, the problem is it's an adversarial process. All right. If I'm the state police and I get a FOIL request, I can be pretty well certain it's not because you want to write a glowing piece about somebody and how wonderful they are. So that's the first problem right there, is that, you know, the guardians of the records realize that if there is anything bad, that's what you're hoping for. I don't know if hoping for is the right word, but that drives your story and you're reporting in a certain direction. So, and then the second thing is, I think most agencies realize that the longer you can stall, the less relevant the story becomes, and at a certain point, maybe it just goes away. So if you can't ever get your information, then you're hamstrung. So, and these people know that. So I think maybe there needs to be a nonpartisan keeper of records or something that can answer these requests. Because, you know, you weren't asking for something from 1980. These are records that are digital, and obviously it would only take a few seconds to type in the person's name and up pops their personnel file, and you can very quickly see, you know, I doubt that this office is getting dozens or hundreds of requests a day. So it's just the intent of freedom of information is great, but it lacks an execution because, again, the people you're requesting the records from are pretty much your adversaries. They know that you're not going to write a happy story if you're asking for somebody's personnel records. And for that matter, they're aware of, they know exactly why you're asking for them and what you're looking to see. So that creates a problem when it's an adversarial process instead of just a clerical one. Oh, okay, you're entitled to these records. Here they are. Happy reporting.
Yeah, and you know, I think when I go back on that thread and I look through it and I look at the points that I was really concerned with, I think the thing that stays with me now is that realistically we should have a more open process. Like, government should err on the side of sharing more and dealing with whatever the consequences are of that than sharing less and leaving a bunch of like questions floating out in the ether. Because if we've learned anything about trust in government, it's that the only way you really create trust in government, real trust in government, is if you're really transparent about who, what, where, why, all of that stuff. So,
well,
you know, you can't make the argument that, you know, well, we can't release that information because it's an active investigation, which is when we get asked for information from law enforcement agencies, often that's what it is. That's what we get.
Well, especially in the case of your reporting, I mean, you made a very specific request. It wasn't a fishing expedition. I want to know whether this man had complaints of this nature when he was on the force. I mean, that's a very specific request and one that's easily answerable. I mean, it would not take very long to click on that record and look and say, no, there were no such accusations, or yes, they were, and here they are. So it isn't as if you're just fishing, and plus, trying to find something negative to write about this man.
Yeah, let's also take that a step deeper, too, and say, if you're a journalist who knows no better, or you're a member of the public, because remember, the public can also submit FOIA requests if they so choose, and you submit a FOIA request for the records that I was seeking, and you're told, nope, sorry, it's going to take 60 days, a lot of people are going to assume, oh, man, that must be a big file. And that can start to lead someone down a path that, at the end of the day, just wouldn't have verified, wouldn't have checked. And then to take that a step further, say it did take them 40 or 50 days to send me back the response that I got, which was literally 2 lines long and said there were no such files to match your request. A lot of people would not believe it. Because if it were in fact that small, or the file were in fact that easily to go through, you'd be asking yourself, well, why the hell couldn't you tell me that on day 1 or day 2? Right.
I mean, I don't know how many requests per day this office gets, but realistically, how many could it be? I mean, it isn't as if, we're all backed up and you're 105th in line, and once we answer the other 104, we'll get to you. I doubt very much that's the case.
Yeah. Well, anyway, where can folks listen to you Monday through Friday?
I'm on the Finger Lakes Morning News on Finger Lakes News Radio. In Auburn, that's 98.1 FM and 1590 AM, WAUB. In Geneva, it's 106.3 FM and 1240 AM, WGVA. And coming next week, high school basketball and hockey.
All right. We'll be back next week, guys. We'll see you.